Neighbors said they heard the front door slam at exactly 6:15 in the morning. Not the gentle click of someone leaving for work. Not the soft shuffle of a man heading out to catch traffic before it swallowed the whole expressway. This was different. This was the kind of slam that makes curtains move in 5 different houses at once. By 6:20, Tobenna had already packed a bag. Not his own. Hers. By 7 a.m., the estate's WhatsApp group, the same group that shared prayer points, missing generator parts, and complaints about noisy generators, had a new photograph circulating through it. A photograph taken from outside a bedroom window, through a gap in the curtains, by someone who should not have been looking in the first place. In the photo, a man kneels on the floor. A woman sits above him on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. To anyone scrolling through their phone before their morning devotion, it looked like exactly one thing. A marriage ending. A husband, finally done. A wife, finally caught. The dirty housewife everyone in the estate had quietly judged for months, the one whose curtains were never washed, whose children sometimes came to school with wrinkled uniforms, whose home help kept resigning one after another, had finally pushed her husband too far. She has been warned, one comment read. "Ndi women we know sabai manage house, na so e day end," said another. Meaning, this is exactly how it ends for women who don't know how to manage a home. By 9 a.m., someone had even tagged the estate chairman, asking if something should be done before the situation embarrasses the whole compound. Everyone had an opinion. Nobody had the truth. Because what looked like the end of something was actually the beginning of the only decision Tobenna had made in 11 years of marriage that he was completely, unshakably certain about. But to understand how a man went from silence, to sweeping up after his wife for months, to packing her bags at dawn while she wept on their bed, we have to go back. 3 months. Before the whispers. Before the photograph. Before anyone in that estate thought they had this story figured out. Because they didn't. Before we continue, if you're the kind of person who loves stories that don't go where you expect them to, hit that subscribe button right now, because trust me, this one is going to surprise you. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Chiamaka Adiz Okonji was, by every visible measure, a woman who had it together. She ran her own event planning company, Kai Events and Decor, the kind of business that thrived on Instagram before and afters, on brides crying happy tears in her comment sections, on being tagged in wedding posts with captions like "She turned our budget into a dream." For 4 years, Kai Events had been one of the more requested names in Lekki and its surrounding estates. Chiamaka herself always arrived at these events looking flawless, jewel tied with architectural precision, heels that never seemed to tire her, a smile she wore like part of her uniform. At home, it was a different story. And everyone on Providence Street, their estate, had noticed. It started small. The kind of small that nobody comments on out loud, but everyone quietly registers. The gardener mentioned once, to another neighbor's gardener, that the flowers in front of the Okonji duplex hadn't been watered in weeks. The woman 2 houses down, Mrs. Balogun, mentioned during a Sunday fellowship that she'd seen Chiamaka's twins go to school with the exact same socks 2 days in a row, not washed, oh, I mean the exact same ones, still smelling like play from the day before. Small comments. Small judgments. The kind that build, slowly, into a reputation. Inside the house, it was worse than the neighbors could see. Dishes piled in the sink for 2, sometimes 3 days. Not because there was no help. Chiamaka had gone through 4 housekeepers in 8 months, each one resigning quietly, citing reasons that never fully added up. "Madam no day to organize," one had told the agency. "I no fit continue like this." The living room curtains had a permanent grey tinge that no amount of quick washing seemed to lift. Laundry sat in baskets, clean and dirty mixed together, until someone, usually Tobenna, sorted through it late at night after the children were asleep. Tobenna Okonji worked at one of the mid-tier commercial banks on Victoria Island, the kind of job that required him to look sharp, speak carefully, and never, under any circumstances, bring his personal problems into the open plan office. He was the kind of man colleagues described as solid. Reliable. The type who remembered your birthday, who covered your shift without complaint, who never raised his voice in a meeting even when frustrated. At home, That same solidness had, for over a year now, been quietly absorbing everything his wife had stopped doing. He was the one who now packed the children's lunch bags before school, standing in the kitchen at 5:45 a.m., his tie loosely hanging around his neck because he hadn't finished dressing yet. He was the one who called the school to explain, again, why the twins' uniforms looked a little worn. He was the one who, after long days at the bank, came home to cook, badly, but he cooked, because if he waited for Chiamaka, everyone would eat past 9. His mother, Mama Ugonna, visited more often than either of them wanted, and every visit came with the same commentary, delivered in the calm, needling tone only a Nigerian mother-in-law can perfect. "Tobenna, a house does not clean itself," she said one Saturday afternoon, running a single finger along the top of the television unit and holding it up, coated in dust, as evidence in a trial only she was presiding over. "You are not a small boy. You should not be doing woman's work in your own house while your wife is out arranging other people's weddings." "Mama, please," Tobenna said, rubbing his temple. "It is not that simple." "It is exactly that simple," his mother replied. "A woman who cannot organize her own home, what is she organizing, eh? Other people's joy, while her own house is in mourning." Chiamaka, when she was home to hear these comments, brushed them off with the same practiced ease she used to calm down difficult clients. "Mama, please, I am tired," she said one evening, not even looking up from her phone. "I just finished a 200-guest wedding in Ikoyi. I don't have the strength to be discussing dust on a television." "You never have the strength," Mama Ugonna said quietly, almost to herself, but loud enough to be heard. Tobenna, standing between them as he always seemed to be lately, said nothing. He had learned, over the past year, that saying something usually made things worse. Chiamaka did not respond well to being told what to do. Never had, not since university, where her friends used to joke that she had married the calm one because she herself carried a fire that needed no fanning. But privately, alone at night, Tobenna's frustration had begun curdling into something heavier. Something closer to resentment. He loved his wife. He was certain of that, even on the hardest nights. But he had started to feel like a man slowly disappearing into someone else's neglected life. One dirty dish, one unwashed school sock, one avoided conversation at a time. There had been a time, not so long ago, when things were different. Tobenna still remembered the early years of their marriage clearly, the small flat they'd started in before the twins were born, before Kai events and decor existed as anything more than an idea Chiamaka scribbled in a notebook during her lunch breaks at a marketing agency she'd hated. Back then, she used to hum while cleaning, used to rearrange the furniture every few months just for the joy of a new arrangement, used to leave little notes tucked into his shirt pockets before he left for work. She had been, by every account, house-proud, not out of pressure, but because the home they were building together had felt, to her, like a project worth caring for. Somewhere between the twins arriving, the business taking off, and the slow accumulation of pressure from every direction, that version of Chiamaka had quietly gone missing. Tobenna hadn't noticed the exact day she disappeared. He only noticed, one afternoon almost a year ago, that he could no longer remember the last time he'd heard her humming. He mentioned this once to Efima, Chiamaka's closest friend since university, hoping she might have insight he lacked. "She hasn't talked to you about the business?" Efima had asked carefully, choosing her words like she was walking across broken glass. "What about the business?" Efima had hesitated, then shaken her head. "You should ask her yourself, Tobenna. It's not my place." That conversation had stayed with him, a small splinter he couldn't quite dig out, though at the time he hadn't understood its significance. He assumed, wrongly, that whatever Efima was hinting at was simply more of the same: exhaustion, overwork, the ordinary strain of running a business. He had no idea, not yet, how close to the surface real danger was sitting. And there was something else. Something he hadn't said out loud to anyone, not even his closest friend. Chiamaka had started hiding her phone. Not dramatically. Nothing that would look suspicious to a stranger. But Tobenna noticed, the way she turned the screen away when it buzzed during dinner, the way she'd excuse herself to the balcony for calls she used to take right there in the living room, the way her face would tighten for just a second before she composed it back into casualness. He didn't know what it meant yet. He only knew that something in his marriage had shifted, and he no longer recognized the shape of it. By the third month of what Tobenna privately called the slow collapse, things had reached a point where even Chiamaka's closest friends had started to notice. Every Thursday night, 3 or 4 of them gathered at the Okonji house for what they called wine and unwind, a tradition that had started innocently enough 2 years earlier as a way for Chiamaka to decompress from a demanding week of weddings and difficult clients. Bottles of wine, plastic cups because who wants to wash glasses afterward, loud laughter that spilled out into the compound, just about husbands, about business, about the state of the country. Tobenna used to enjoy these nights, in the beginning. He liked seeing his wife laugh freely, liked the version of her that came out around her girls. Looser, funnier, less armored than the polished event planner the public saw. But lately, the Thursday nights had started to feel like something else. An escape hatch Chiamaka disappeared into while the house around her fell further into disorder. One particular Thursday, Tobenna came home from work to find the living room already loud with laughter, 4 bottles of wine already open on the center table. The same center table that still had a coffee ring stain from 2 weeks earlier that no one had wiped off. The twins were in their room, unsupervised, the television blaring something inappropriate for their age because no one had checked what they were watching. Dishes from breakfast still sat in the sink. A basket of laundry had migrated from the bedroom to the hallway, where it had apparently been sitting long enough that someone's slipper was now resting on top of it. "Baby, you're back." Chiamaka called out, wine glass, plastic cup, raised toward him. "Come and greet the girls now." Tobenna managed a tight smile at Chiamaka's friends, greeted them politely, the way a man raised properly greets his wife's guests regardless of what is feeling underneath. Then he quietly went to the kitchen, put the kettle on for the twins' dinner, and began clearing the sink himself while the laughter continued in the other room, entirely oblivious to him. It was his best friend, Uche, who finally said something to him directly. They'd known each other since secondary school, and Uche had watched the transformation happen from a comfortable distance for months. "Bro, I'm not trying to enter your business," Uche said one evening over suya and small beer at their usual spot. "But see, you're not looking like yourself again. You've lost weight. You look tired every time I see you." "Work is much," Tobenna said, which was true, but not the whole truth. Uche wasn't convinced. "Is it Chiamaka?" Tobenna was quiet for a long moment, turning his beer bottle slowly on the table. "She's not the woman I married anymore," he finally said. "Or maybe she is, and I just didn't know this part of her existed. I don't know which is worse." "You need to take control," Uche said, leaning forward. "I'm serious. Some of these women, if you don't put your foot down early, ego te reach where you go day beg for respect for your own house. You should tell her straight, either she changes, or something has to give. Some men even expose their wives on social media these days. You know, let shame do what talking cannot do. Make her feel what the outside world feels when they see your house." Tobenna shook his head slowly. "I'm not doing that." "Then what will you do? Continue like this until your kids grow up thinking this is normal?" That question sat with Tobenna long after the conversation ended. It followed him home that night, sat with him as he once again found himself sorting laundry at 11 p.m. while Chiamaka slept, exhausted from a day that, to his knowledge, hadn't involved a single wedding or client meeting. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the Okonji household, the estate's judgment had begun taking on a life of its own, the way these things often do in Lagos compounds where everyone somehow knows everyone else's business without ever being formally told. Mrs. Balogun, the same neighbor who'd first noticed the twins' repeated socks, had now upgraded her observations into something closer to a full report. At the estate's monthly residents' meeting, held under the canopy tent beside the security post, she found a way to mention, unprompted, that some wives these days forget that a husband is not a houseboy. "I'm not calling any name," she added quickly, glancing sideways, "but we all know who I mean." A ripple of knowing laughter passed through the small crowd. Someone else, a retired civil servant named Chief Adeyemi, who fancied himself the estate's moral compass, cleared his throat and added his own commentary. "In my time, a woman's compound was her signature. If the compound is scattered, the marriage will soon be scattered too. Simple as that." Nobody in that gathering knew about the cancelled weddings. Nobody knew about the loan repayment quietly crushing Chiamaka a little more each week. Nobody knew about the nights she cried silently in the bathroom with the tap running so no one would hear. They knew only what they could see from the outside: an unkempt compound, a tired-looking husband, a wife who seemed increasingly absent even when she was physically present, and from that thin slice of visible evidence, they had already written the whole story, cast the villain, and decided the ending. Tobenna heard about the meeting secondhand, from a neighbor's houseboy who mentioned it in passing. He said nothing about it to Chiamaka, but it added one more weight to the growing pile pressing down on him, the sense that everyone around him had already decided what he should do, long before he understood what was actually happening in his own home. It was around this time that Mama Ugonna escalated her own campaign. She began visiting twice a week instead of once, always arriving with a fresh observation, always delivered with the practiced calm of a woman who believed she was only speaking hard truths out of love. "Tobenna, I have been patient," she said one Saturday, seated stiffly on the parlor sofa, eyes scanning the room for evidence. "But a man who allows his home to fall into disorder is a man other people will stop respecting. Even at your bank, people talk. Do you think your ogre does not hear things?" "Mama, please, my job has nothing to do with my house." "Everything is connected," she said firmly. "A disorganized home produces a distracted man. A distracted man makes mistakes at work. Before you know it, the mistakes cost you your position, and then what? You will blame Chiamaka, but by then it will be too late." Tobenna wanted, more than once, to tell his mother the truth, that something deeper was clearly wrong with his wife, that this wasn't simple laziness or disrespect, that he suspected there was a reason behind the withdrawal that none of them had bothered to ask about. But he held back, partly out of loyalty to Chiamaka, and partly because he himself did not yet have the full picture. That clarity would only come 2 weeks later, on the night he finally found her crying alone on the balcony. His mother's pressure. His friend's suggestion. The estate's quiet judgment. It all pressed in on him from different directions, all pointing toward the same conclusion, that he needed to do something dramatic. Confront her publicly. Embarrass her the way she had, in his eyes, embarrassed him and their household. Take control, as Uche put it. Be a real man, as his mother implied. He almost did it. There was one night, the night that came closest to the version of this story everyone assumed had happened, when Tobenna sat across from Chiamaka at the dinner table, their food barely touched, and opened his mouth to finally say everything he had been holding back for over a year. But before the words came out, he noticed something he had somehow missed for weeks. Chiamaka's hands were trembling slightly around her fork. Her eyes, when she glanced up at him, had a hollowness to them that had nothing to do with tiredness from event planning. And her phone, sitting face down beside her plate as always these days, buzzed once. She flinched, actually flinched, before turning it further away from him. Whatever he had planned to say died in his throat. Instead, he asked something he had never thought to ask in over a year of quiet frustration. "Chiamaka," he said gently, "are you okay?" She looked up at him, startled, as though the question itself was unexpected, as though nobody had asked her that in a very long time, including herself. "I'm fine," she said, too quickly. "Just tired." But her eyes said something else entirely. And for the first time, Tobenna decided to actually listen to what her eyes were saying, instead of only reacting to what her hands weren't doing. It took him another 2 weeks of quiet observation before he finally understood. He didn't confront her. He didn't snoop through her phone, though the temptation had crossed his mind more than once. Instead, he did something his mother would never have suggested and his friend would never have understood. He simply started paying closer attention. He noticed that Chiamaka's business, the one that still looked flawless on Instagram, had actually lost 2 major clients in the last 3 months. Weddings that had been cancelled or moved to competitors, for reasons she had never mentioned to him. He noticed that a payment he'd assumed had gone toward vendor deposits had instead gone toward a business loan repayment she'd taken out without telling him, one that was now behind schedule. He noticed, on the rare occasion her phone was left unlocked on the kitchen counter, a string of unread messages from her accountant, growing increasingly urgent, none of them opened. And one Thursday night, after her friends had left and the twins were finally asleep, he found her sitting alone on the balcony in the dark, not drinking, not scrolling her phone, just sitting, staring out at nothing, tears sliding down her face in complete silence. He didn't say anything at first. He simply sat down beside her. "Talk to me," he said quietly, after several minutes had passed. "Please. Whatever it is." And that night, for the first time in over a year, Chiamaka finally did. She told him about the 2 cancelled weddings, one because the couple had heard, through the industry grapevine, whispers that Kai Events was losing its touch, the other because a competitor had undercut her badly on price during a slow season. She told him about the business loan she'd taken out to cover a deposit shortfall, certain she could repay it before anyone noticed, and how the repayment schedule had quietly become a monthly source of panic she carried entirely alone. She told him that for months she had felt like a fraud, a woman who built other people's dream celebrations while her own dreams, her own sense of competence, had quietly been crumbling behind a polished Instagram grid. "I didn't want you to see me fail," she said, her voice breaking. "You already had so much pressure from your mother, from your job. I thought if I could just fix it myself, quietly, before you noticed, then I wouldn't have to be the wife who failed at her own business on top of failing at this house." Chiamaka. "I stopped caring about the house because I stopped caring about myself," she continued, the words coming faster now, like a dam finally breaking after holding back too much water for too long. "Every time I looked at that mess, it just felt like more proof that I was failing at everything. So I stopped looking. I know that doesn't make sense." "It makes sense," Tobenna said softly. And it did. Because the woman his mother called lazy, the woman the estate WhatsApp group called dirty, the woman his friend told him to expose publicly for shame, she wasn't the villain of some simple story about a woman who refused to do her wifely duties. She was a woman drowning quietly, terrified of what it would mean to ask for help, in a world, in an estate, in a family, in an industry, that had taught her that struggling visibly was its own kind of failure. Tobenna sat with this new understanding for several days before he made his decision. Because now he understood something crucial. Shouting at her, shaming her, taking control the way his mother and his friend had both suggested, would not fix a broken business, would not lift a hidden debt, would not undo months of silent shame she'd been carrying entirely by herself. It would only add his voice to the chorus already telling her she was failing. He needed to do something different. Something nobody in that estate, not his mother, not his friend, not the WhatsApp group already forming its judgments, would ever expect. Now, before we get to what Tobenna actually decided to do, and trust me, it is not what you're expecting, let me know in the comments. Do you think a husband should confront his wife publicly, or handle things privately like Tobenna chose to? I want to hear your honest opinion. And if this story has already surprised you this much, imagine what's coming next. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the ending. Alright, let's continue. Tobenna's plan took him 2 weeks to put together, and he told exactly 2 people about it. His mother, and Chiamaka's best friend, Ifema, both of whom he swore to secrecy. The first thing he did was quietly speak to a financial advisor colleague at his bank, off the record, about restructuring the loan Chiamaka had taken out. Using savings he'd set aside for the twins' school fees the following term, a decision he made without hesitation, certain he'd find another way to cover the fees later, he cleared the overdue balance entirely, before she found out how far behind it had actually fallen. The second thing he did was research something Chiamaka had mentioned once, years earlier, almost in passing, back when they were newly married and she still spoke freely about her dreams before life and business pressures buried them. A wellness retreat in Calabar, run by a former event industry veteran who had burned out spectacularly in her own career before rebuilding. A program designed specifically for entrepreneurs dealing with burnout and financial anxiety, combining rest with genuine business mentorship. 2 weeks. Fully paid, non-refundable, non-negotiable. He called Ifema next, finally understanding the hesitation she'd shown him weeks earlier when he'd first asked about the business. "I know you couldn't tell me," he said, without accusation in his voice. "But I need your help now. Not to expose her. To help her." There was a long pause on the line before Ifema responded, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "She's been carrying this alone for almost a year, Tobenna. She made me promise not to say anything, because she was terrified of what you'd think of her. Terrified you'd see her as less capable, less deserving of the life you'd built together." She could never be less to me, Tobenna said quietly, and found, to his own surprise, that his voice had cracked slightly on the words. Then show her that, Ifema said. Not with words. Words she can talk herself out of believing. Show her with something she can't argue with. That conversation was what finally crystallized the plan fully in his mind. Not a confrontation, not an ultimatum, but proof. Something undeniable enough to cut through months of shame and silence. The third thing he did was speak to his mother, not to complain about Chiamaka, but to ask for her help. Mama, I need you to come and stay with the children for 2 weeks, he told her. Not because Chiamaka has failed. Because she needs rest, and I intend to make sure she takes it. Mama Ugonna, to her credit, was quiet for a long moment on the phone. You are not going to shout at her. Not going to teach her a lesson. I'm going to help her, Mama. That is the lesson. The morning it all came together, Tobenna woke before dawn, exactly as he always did lately, but this time, everything was different. He had already packed a bag, not with anger, not with an ultimatum tucked inside it, but with care. Comfortable clothes for 2 weeks. Her favorite books, ones he'd found untouched on their shelf for over a year. A folder containing the retreat's full itinerary, the loan clearance documents, and a handwritten letter he had stayed up 3 nights writing and rewriting. When Chiamaka woke to find him kneeling by the bed with the bag already packed, her first reaction, the one caught in that photograph, the one that would circulate through the estate's WhatsApp group within the hour, completely misunderstood by everyone who saw it, was pure shock. Tobenna, what is this? She asked, sitting up quickly, panic flooding her face. Are you leaving? Is this? No, he said gently, taking her trembling hands in his. Chiamaka, look at me. This isn't me leaving you. This is me finally seeing you. He opened the folder and walked her through it slowly. The cleared loan. The retreat. The 2 weeks he had arranged with his mother to handle the children and the house completely, so she would have nothing to worry about, nothing to feel guilty over, nothing pulling her back before she was ready. I'm not punishing you, he said, his voice thick with emotion he rarely let show. I stopped waiting for you to become who everyone else wanted you to be. The perfect housewife, the woman with the spotless living room for Mama's inspections. I decided instead to help you become who you actually need to be right now, which is a woman who is allowed to rest, allowed to fail sometimes, allowed to ask for help without it meaning she's less than. The door slam the neighbors heard at 6:15 that morning wasn't Tobenna storming out in fury. It was Chiamaka, overwhelmed, needing a moment alone on the balcony to process what was happening, closing the bedroom door harder than she meant to as she stepped out to catch her breath, not knowing that sound alone would spawn a story the entire estate would spend the whole morning constructing and spreading. The photograph, Tobenna on his knees by the bed, Chiamaka's face in her hands, wasn't a woman being caught in humiliation. It was Tobenna, before she left for the airport 2 hours later, kneeling beside her, holding her hands, praying quietly over her. For safety, for healing, for the courage to rest without guilt, while she wept, not from shame, but from being seen, fully and without judgment, for the first time in longer than she could remember. By the time the estate's WhatsApp group had finished constructing its version of events, the dirty housewife finally caught, the patient husband finally done, the real story was already 30,000 feet in the air, headed toward 2 weeks that would change everything neither the neighbors, nor Mama Ugonna's judgmental friends, nor even Uche, ever expected. During those 2 weeks in Calabar, Chiamaka's days followed a rhythm she hadn't experienced in years. Mornings began with quiet walks along the waterfront before the retreat's structured sessions started. Sessions that mixed practical business mentorship with something she hadn't expected to need as badly as she did, simple permission to rest without guilt attached to it. The retreat's facilitator, a woman named Adiz Nwachukwu who had once run one of the busiest catering companies in Port Harcourt before a very public burnout forced her to rebuild from nothing, told the small group on their first evening something that stayed with Chiamaka long after the retreat ended. Most of you are here because you believe struggling quietly is safer than struggling visibly, Adiz said, looking around the circle of exhausted entrepreneurs. You have spent years believing that if the outside looks fine, the inside doesn't need to be fine too. I am here to tell you, the outside always cracks eventually. The only question is whether you choose when, or whether life chooses for you. Chiamaka thought of the coffee ring on her center table, of the twins' repeated socks, of every small, visible crack that had quietly been announcing, to anyone paying attention, that something inside was breaking long before she was ready to admit it. By the second week, she had drafted a real recovery plan for Kai events and decor, not a desperate scramble to cover debts, but a genuine restructuring, including scaling back to fewer, higher-value events instead of chasing every booking out of financial panic. She had also, for the first time in almost a year, called her mother back home in ORE, not to ask for anything, but simply to talk, to admit that things had been hard, and to hear her mother's voice tell her, gently, that hard seasons do not make a woman a failure. Back in Lagos, Tobenna kept his promise fully. His mother handled the school runs with the twins, though not without occasional complaints about Lagos traffic that had nothing to do with the actual arrangement. Tobenna himself came home each evening and, instead of collapsing into the exhaustion he'd carried for over a year, found himself oddly energized. Cooking dinner not out of obligation but out of a strange, hopeful anticipation, as though he were preparing not just a meal, but a homecoming. On the day Chiamaka returned, he did not meet her with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. He simply stood at the arrival gate at Murtala Muhammad Airport, holding a single sunflower, her favorite, from their university days, when he couldn't afford roses and she'd told him sunflowers were better anyway because they always face the light. She laughed when she saw it, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't heard in over a year, and for the first time in a long while, Tobenna felt certain that whatever came next, they would face it together, in the light, instead of hiding separately in the dark. When Chiamaka returned from Calabar 2 weeks later, the house was not perfect. The curtains still needed washing. There was still a coffee ring on the center table that no one had gotten around to addressing. Some things, realistically, would take much longer than 2 weeks to fully repair. But something fundamental had shifted. She came home rested in a way that showed in her eyes, no longer hollow the way they'd been for months. She came home with a real plan for her business, mapped out with a mentor she'd met at the retreat, instead of a silent, spiraling panic she carried alone. She came home, most importantly, having finally told her husband the truth, and having discovered that truth hadn't cost her his respect, it had earned it. The estate, of course, eventually learned the real story. Mostly because Efima, tired of the gossip, corrected the narrative loudly at the next fellowship meeting, much to Mama Ugona's quiet satisfaction. Some neighbors felt embarrassed at how quickly they'd judged. Others simply moved on to the next piece of gossip, the way estates always do. Mrs. Balogun, to her credit, was among the first to apologize, catching Chiamaka one afternoon by the estate gate. "I didn't know," she said, wringing her hand slightly. "We only saw what was in front of us. We didn't ask what was behind it." "Most people don't," Chiamaka replied, without bitterness, only a kind of tired understanding. "I didn't either, about myself, for a long time." Even Chief Adeyemi, who had so confidently declared at the residents' meeting that a scattered compound meant a scattered marriage, found himself quieter on the subject in the months that followed. Though he never did formally retract his earlier comments, the way men of his generation rarely do. Mama Ugona's transformation was perhaps the most surprising of all. Having seen firsthand, during her 2 weeks running the household, exactly how much her son had quietly been carrying. The school runs, the meal planning, the endless small logistics of a home in crisis, she returned to her own house with a newfound humility. She never again mentioned dust on the television unit. Instead, she began calling Chiamaka every Sunday evening, not to inspect, but simply to ask how she was doing, a small ritual that neither of them had expected, but both came to treasure. But for Tobenna and Chiamaka, something important had been settled that no WhatsApp group could touch. They learned that a stubborn heart, a struggling heart, is rarely healed by shouting, shame, or public exposure, the things everyone around them had suggested. Sometimes, the deepest change comes not from forcing someone to fix what's broken, but from quietly helping them understand why it broke in the first place. Tobenna could have taken his mother's advice and taken control. He could have taken Uche's advice and exposed her publicly, let shame do the work he didn't have the stomach for. Either path would have confirmed everything the estate already believed about a woman who refused to change. Instead, he chose to ask a harder, quieter question, not what is wrong with her, But what is she carrying that I haven't noticed? And that decision, more than any confrontation ever could have, was what truly shocked everyone who thought they already knew how this story would end. Because the real lesson isn't that a dirty house means a failing wife, or that a patient husband eventually runs out of patience. The real lesson is this: behind almost every mess we judge from the outside, there is usually a story we haven't bothered to ask about. And sometimes, the most powerful decision a person can make isn't to walk away, or to shout, or to shame, but to kneel down quietly and finally ask the question everyone else forgot to ask. If this story touched you tonight, do me a favor, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear that behind every mess is usually a story worth understanding before we judge it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we tell stories like this every single week. Stories that make you feel, that make you think, and that remind us all to look a little closer before we judge what we see on the surface. Drop a comment and tell me, has there ever been a moment in your own life where someone chose to understand you instead of judge you? I'd love to read your story. Until next time, take care of each other.